This talk is part of our celebrating 125 years of St. Bride Library lecture series, which has kindly been sponsored by Adobe, Commercial Type, iMagazine, Eric de Belague, Google, Jerry Wright, Just Another Foundry, Klim Type Foundry, Lex and GB Creative and Innovative Print, Mayor of London, Mediato Graphics and Animation, Peter Longland, R Typography, Trevor Fenwick, Type By, Usborne Publishing, and the Wynkin de Word Charitable Trust, who have sponsored students and recent graduates to attend this lecture. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm so delighted to be speaking to a community related to the St. Bride's Library, partly because I teach in a college which is mostly devoted to three-dimensional material culture. And I often have to justify my interest in graphics or flat material, as they might see it. So at least tonight, I know I'm speaking to people who don't need to be persuaded that this material is important. So what I'm going to be talking about is a rather broad-based movement, which in my view was the seminal revolution in graphic design between the traditional forms of book typography, which had existed for over 500 years, and the modern era, which underwent a revolution in the 1920s. And it's this revolution that I want to explore today. I hope by the end of this talk, you'll appreciate that it was not an isolated or individualist movement. It may have appeared in various centers, but it was coordinated and it had clear aims and objectives that were shared across several groups and individuals. Now, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of designers whose names may be unfamiliar, but with such an informed audience as this, I am hoping some of you will have heard of Walter Dexel or Max Burchartz or Johannes Molzahn. And if not, I hope you'll emerge from this talk with a better understanding of figures who are not household names, but who were major innovators alongside some of the more famous architect designers. Now, all the material I'll be showing you came from the collection of Jan Tschichold, and I'm sure Tschichold is known to anyone interested in typography in Britain. But as I said in the covering note for this talk, Tschichold had begun a correspondence with designers all over Europe in the 1920s in an attempt to educate himself and get abreast of the exciting recent developments in print design and design theory. And this grew into a huge collection of all types of printed matter, from posters to bus tickets and everything in between. And Tschichold quickly appreciated that this study collection was a survey of the disparate tendencies at a moment of radical innovation. And he called this his museum. And the bulk of it now exists in several public collections, but I might come back to that later. Anyway, I'm going to start with someone whom I'm sure you will know. That's the Hungarian constructivist, artist-designer Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who in 1923 wrote a short essay entitled Die neue Typography in the catalogue to the famous exhibition of the Bauhaus in Weimar in 1923. Now, you may remember that this was the exhibition where the Bauhaus masters and students set out to persuade the public, and above all the authorities in Weimar, that a commitment to modern design would be of value to their region. Moholy-Nagy had only been a member of staff at the Bauhaus for about 6 weeks. So this catalogue and essay must have been just about the first thing that he did in the college following his appointment in April 1923. He designed the catalogue, coordinated the exhibition, and used this as a manifesto for the new aims of the Bauhaus. Indeed, it would be that summer that Gropius came up with a new motto or a statement of aims: art and technology, a new unity. But in many respects, it was Moholy-Nagy who implemented the new policy. And as you can see from the design and layout of the catalogue, it was presented in quite a radical and new manner. Look at the insert, the bottom left, and notice the way that Moholy-Nagy breaks up the page into discrete blocks, using these heavy lines to indicate the asymmetry in the design, but at the same time, a sense of balance, juxtaposing sections of heavy type with blocks of standard type, all organized into quite rigid rectilinear areas. The cover on the right is actually by Herbert Buyer, still a student at the time, but already showing an interest in modern design. And the reason that I'm drawing attention to the essay above all, which you can see, that's all it is at the top there, one page. It's only about 500 words long. But Moholy-Nagy is making a number of claims about what he believes typography can and should do. He opens with the claim that typography is an instrument of communication, so it must be as clear and effective as possible. Now, there's nothing unusual in that. People have been stating the same view for several hundred years. But then he goes on to say that the essence and purpose of printing require the uninhibited use of all linear directions, so not just horizontal, all typefaces, all fonts, font sizes, geometric shapes, colors. And then he says, given the elasticity, variability, and vitality within the contents of a sentence, we must create a typographic language that is subject, first of all, to the inner laws of the expression and the optical effect on the viewer. In other words, typography, I'm not quoting now, must become more expressive, more agile, and closer to the way that people talk. Now, he makes a number of other statements, which were quite radical at the time. First of all, we must use photography alone for illustration. And I'm quoting here when he says, books with photographic reproductions already exist, but the photographs are only a secondary explanation of the text. Recent developments supersede this phase, and now photographs must take their place within the text. Then on a final statement, he says, one could even say that such a use of photography will lead shortly to the replacement of a substantial part of literature with film. Film will soon be as common a technique as printing is now. So, what we're left with is a view that reading text on a page is merely an intermediate stage in a process which will ultimately see the triumph of film as our principal medium of communication. Now, whether we accept any of this, we should perhaps see it as a manifesto of very grand futuristic aims, coming as it did from someone who did not know how to set type and had very little first-hand experience of printing. In fact, Moholy-Nagy had probably only succeeded in printing some of his own lino cuts at this stage. But that didn't stop him from thinking through the potential of typography and print to communicate and transmit information. Now, Moholy was not the first to make these claims. In fact, he was picking up on a groundswell of fascination with typography by various figures from the European avant-garde, many of whom were driven to make comments and pronouncements on the role of type and text in shaping the future of society. Now, one of the first to take this up seriously was the German Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, who already in 1919 had begun to experiment with type, and quite apart from his famous Merz collages, he had begun to work with printers and publishers, first of all to produce his own magazine called Merz, which throughout the 1920s was consistently a forum for experimental typography. The examples I'm showing now are from Merz number 11, 1924, which show specimens of Schwitter's own advertising design such as the Pelican ink advertisement with the large question mark in the top left. But more significantly, this was also the issue in which Schwitters published his own manifesto, the so-called Theses on Typography, putting forward many of the ideas that Moholy-Nagy had proposed the previous year. And he also identified that there were a number of compatriots in the movement to revolutionize type, especially in the Dutch group, De Stijl, which had been set up in 1917, committed to a program of absolute abstraction, the use of only verticals and horizontals, and the deployment of solely primary colors and non-colors. And this was almost immediately translated into their attempts to redesign the physical environment, houses, cafes, interiors, as well as paintings, and ultimately into all forms of communication. So while Van Doesburg was designing in houses and cafes with these strict regulated principles of form and color, he was also experimenting with the ways in which they could be applied to typography and graphic design. Now, I should say the term graphic design had not entered common usage at that time. It was only coined, as far as I know, in America in 1923. So the concept or that area of responsibility had not really been defined in Europe, but it was clearly recognized. So Van Doesburg was in a way applying his aesthetic principles to typography, employing the equipment that one could readily find in a jobbing print workshop. I'm showing here a few issues of the magazine De Stijl, which indicates the rather crude but genuine attempts to find a printed or typographic expression of the aesthetic so that the form could express the content of De Stijl ideas. But the key figure in this engagement with typography among the avant-garde was the Russian or Soviet expatriate ElLissitzky. ElLissitzky had already studied architecture in Germany before the First World War, and he returned immediately after the war, where he was a resident for long periods in the 1920s as a sort of emissary for the Soviet avant-garde and as a propagandist for the revolution. It probably wasn't shown here, but there was a very interesting exhibition in New York in 2018 on the art school in Vitebsk, where ElLissitzky had undergone something of a dramatic conversion. On the top left here, you can see something of the early illustrative work that he was producing, mostly for Yiddish presses in Poland and Russia, and for whom he produced these rather fanciful illustrations of folk tales and children's stories. Then in October 1919, he met Malevich, and all of his earlier work went out the window. He was basically converted absolutely to an unrelenting abstraction based upon Malevich's suprematism, which employed geometric forms floating in an indeterminate space. Now, this conversion was immediate and comprehensive because it was just a few months later that he produced this, from the suite of Jewish folk tales, that he produced his most famous example in the new manner, the so-called Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge poster, which you can see on the bottom left. There's probably only a matter of weeks between these two images on the left-hand side, which gives you some indication of how dramatic this shift was. Perhaps the most famous example of ElLissitzky's new manner is the ostensible children's book, Pro Dva Quadrata, About Two Squares, or as I always knew it, The Story of Two Squares, which is the same principles applied to book printing, as seen in the 4 pages on the right. So far did ElLissitzky reject the old narrative of children's literature that one might see this as an attempt to feed children undiluted suprematism. In other words, they should not be getting stories of giants, fairies, and animals, but instead immerse themselves in the story of geometric forms, a red square and a black square, and their journey through the world, after which they fly off into outer space and then return to Earth to establish communism. I'm sure it made perfect sense at the time. I'm never sure whether ElLissitzky really believed this or had a bit of ironic humor in the book, but it's true that this was produced in Germany and the Netherlands by an art publisher, so it was probably intended as a collectible for the avant-garde. However, there's no question that ElLissitzky was committed to these ideals, and while he was resident in Germany, he was very active in printing, designing, publishing, and promoting the ideals of socialism, communism, and suprematism, which in the new principles that united politics, abstraction, and the avant-garde. These are a sample of 3 publications that he produced in Germany at this time. West, or Object, a short-lived magazine that he edited with Ilya Ehrenberg. At the bottom is For the Voice, a radical volume of poems by Mayakovsky, employing typographic forms, basically the elements of the typecase, rules, letter forms, etc., to create a series of expressive, onomatopoeic sound poems, so that in reading and looking, one could engage with the meaning through sound and its formal equivalents on the page. Another aspect of this book, linking it to the emerging constructivist aesthetic, is that the design with its thumb markers down the right-hand side emulates the design of technical manuals, not the rarefied fine printing of the previous generation, and indeed of his contemporaries who were producing such things as the livre d'artiste. But ElLissitzky's finest piece of pure typographic design was probably Merz numbers 8 to 9 in 1924, which he not only designed, but also produced alongside Schwitters, publishing his own theory of typographic design, the so-called topography of typography. Here he proposed that it was not the legibility of the text that was most important, but the visual characteristics of the page. In this manifesto, Leshitschi came up with 8 statements, a bit like commandments, and the first of these stated unequivocally that the words on the printed surface are taken in by seeing, not by hearing. Further down, he calls for economy of expression, optics rather than phonetics. And what you can see here is he's shifting the emphasis away from the traditional patterns of typographic training regarding layout and legibility in favor of a much more experimental approach to the way that the page can be composed, employing abstract as well as textual or literary elements. Now, these disparate experimental tendencies were brought together in an unusual publication in 1925 called Elementor Typography, elemental typography, not elementary. It means that it's typography reduced to its most basic elements, not simplified. This was a special issue of Typographische Mitteilungen, Typography Studies, the monthly journal of the Union of Book Printers. We are not accustomed to thinking of trade unions as agents of avant-garde ideas, at least not in Britain. But the Journal of the German Union of Book Printers is one of the most radical organs of the 1920s. In this case, the union had handed over responsibility for editing this special issue to a 23-year-old typographer named Jan Tschichold. Tschichold had trained in Leipzig in calligraphy, sign writing, typography, and lithographic printing. but he developed a fascination with the avant-garde, and he badgered the main editor to use the journal as a forum for these new ideas, which were already circulating in the art world and even among printers. What Tschichold produced, therefore, was an issue that presented a series of radical statements. It was full of manifestos with sweeping claims for social and aesthetic change. And if you look down the list of contributors at the bottom right of the title page, in the top left, you'll see the names of the people he included: Nathan Altman, Otto Baumberger, Herbert Buyer, Max Burchartz, ElLissitzky, Ladislav Moholy-Nagy, Molnar Farkas, Johannes Maltzen, Kurt Schwitters, Mart Stam, and finally, someone called Ivan Tschichold. He'd changed his name to Ivan, having been so inspired by the idea of the Russian Revolution as the dawn of a new age, as much as politics and society, and the fountainhead of this new aesthetic in design and art. What Tschichold came up with for this publication was 10 statements, again like the 10 Commandments. Now, I'm not going to go through all 10 of them, but I do want to highlight 5, which I think encapsulate both the general and the specific in Tschichold's ideals, bringing together this very dynamic manifesto campaign to transform design in a somewhat declamatory and even intolerant view of alternative views. The first of these is the new typography is purposeful. In other words, it could never be casual or passive. It had to have an aim. The second is that the purpose of typography is communication. The message must appear in its shortest, simplest, and most urgent form. Now, he's clearly not talking about traditional typography for books and novels. He sees typography as a medium through which ideas can be communicated immediately and powerfully and with strong emphasis. And the fourth, he says, the elemental means of typography are letters, numbers, signs, and rules from the typecase. But this includes the precise image. Photography and the elemental letter form is sans serif. This is one of the key statements that we'll come back to later, to the effect that there are 2 fundamental tools or elements that the new typography must adopt absolutely: sans serif letter forms and photography for illustration. Indeed, Tschichold was very militant about this, later stating categorically, there is no excuse for any other forms. And at that time, he was keen to have the older processes and type that did not conform to the new ideals thrown out, destroyed, or excluded from the printer's workshop, as these would be a drag on the total revolution that he and his compatriots were introducing. The seventh points out is to increase the urgency and sensational effect of the new typography, vertical and diagonal line directions can be used simultaneously. We should cease observing the rigid conventions of reading from left to right, but can now use all forms that seem appropriate to the message. In a simple throwaway line, number 8, he says, elemental design excludes the use of any ornament. Any was in bold. There is no exception to this. So no fleurons, no decoration. And finally, elemental design is never absolute or definitive. Typographic design will constantly change. To me, this has always seemed rather like a Trotskyist statement, advocating a pattern of permanent revolution. Whatever we think is radical now, in 10 years' time, it will be old-fashioned and perhaps redundant. So typography must be on a revolutionary footing to keep abreast of changes in other areas of life. Now, Tschichold put these ideas into practice. Sorry about that. And indeed, it was a range of works that he was employed to produce soon after his move to Munich, because his first major client was Phoebus Palast, a cinema chain and film production company. Sometimes these posters had to be produced in only 24 hours because they did not always know what films would be shown until very late, and often had only 1 or 2 publicity photographs to illustrate the coming attraction. Even in these constrained circumstances, you can see all the elements that Tschichold advocated in these posters. Asymmetry, sans serif letter forms, various sizes of type, the use of photography for illustration, and very bold angles and disparate lines of text to emphasize the various items of information. These are 2 of his finest posters for Phoebus. Napoleon by Abel Gance, now quite a famous silent film, and Die Frau ohne Namen, The Woman Without a Name, which has rather disappeared from view. Nevertheless, in the poster, you can see something of the way in which he's using the routine tools of the typecase in a very dynamic manner, giving us a steep recession through orthogonals and bold juxtapositions of simple geometric shapes, primary colors. This was not merely a personal design feature. These aspects of the posters were participating in a larger debate throughout German art and design circles. In the mid-1920s, Expressionism was still a vital force throughout German cultural life, particularly in film. And Tschichold, like Siegfried Kracauer, George Lukács, Bertolt Brecht, and ultimately Walter Benjamin, felt that it was a dreadful reactionary movement that deserved to be stamped out if the new rationalist principles were to come to the fore. You may recall that much later, Siegfried Kracauer would write a famous book of film criticism entitled From Caligari to Hitler, suggesting that there was a link between the delirious surrender to the emotions that was a feature of Expressionism and the rise of Nazism. Indeed, in 1927, Tschichold wrote to his friend in the Netherlands, Piet Zwart, that he thought Metropolis was, and I'm quoting here, probably the worst film ever made. Now, within this, you can see something of the contrast between 2 strands in the German avant-garde of the 1920s. In these 2 posters for the same film, Laster der Menschheit, The Vice of Humanity, from 1927, a rather lurid film about drug addiction and sexual exploitation. Nevertheless, I think you can get some idea of these 2 camps beginning to face up to one another in the mid-1920s, seeing their aesthetics as mutually incompatible and in direct competition. Now, many of these debates with regard to graphic design were brought to a head in 1928 when Tschichold published the book that would become the definitive statement of the movement, Die neue Typography, where the earlier journal, Elementary Typography, had been a series of manifestos and rather grand statements about the way that society would be shaped by new developments in typography and design. This was a much more practical book. Indeed, its subtitle is A Handbook for Printers, and that's precisely what it was. It's full of advice and instructions about how to obtain certain effects. Do this, don't do that. If you want to achieve this effect, try this technique and such like. And you can see from the image on the bottom right how Tschichold was warning against symmetrical layouts in double columns of text, especially with illustrations, which allows for more sensitive and imaginative layout. With the bold red cross through one layout, it's easy to see what is good and what is bad about these designs. And that's the way that the book was presented, because unlike Kurt Schwitters, ElLissitzky, and Moholy-Nagy, Tschichold had been trained as a printer and typographer. He'd served an apprenticeship and then completed his training in a technical college, and he'd come through the trade rather than through the art world. He was not dabbling in printing as a potential new medium. He was operating in the opposite direction, getting interested in avant-garde art and the ways in which that could be brought into the practice of the working typographer and printer. Now, Tschichold was primarily a book designer. That's the field in which he was trained, in which he practiced most of his life. And this is indicative when you see some of his finest designs and the ways that he applied the grander theoretical ideas into his design work. These are two of his works from the late 1920s. Ene Bierman was the first in a series of proposed photographic books that he planned with Franz Rohe. But it was Tschichold alone who produced the book on the right, Photo Eye, with its famous self-portrait photo montage of ElLissitzky, known as the constructor. Tschichold and ElLissitzky remained friends and correspondents until the end of Leshitsky's life in 1944. And interestingly, after both men had died, their wives or their widows carried on a correspondence right up to the 1970s, some of it very revealing about the relative responsibilities of the men and women in what was really a series of collaborative partnerships. Jan and Edith Tschichold, ElLissitzky and Sophie Coopers, and most revealingly, Laszlo and Lucia Moholy-Nagy. I might come back to that slightly later. Schwitters, Moholy-Nagy, ElLissitzky and Tschichold could not have effected this revolution in typography without a lot of institutional support. And these middle years of the 1920s saw the introduction of new technologies and resources that enabled their theories to be realized in practice. Particularly, you can see the introduction of the Futura typeface in 1927 by the Bauer Foundry in Frankfurt. Designed by Paul Renner, it would become the most popular face among the new typographers. Where they would previously have used airbar or a range of grotesque faces, Futura was now the sans serif of choice, and it was promoted very much as something that was suitable for new techniques like photomontage. Alongside this, in 1925, the Leica 35mm single lens reflex camera was launched at the Leipzig Print Fair. This revolutionized photography and made photography available to people who had not necessarily served a traditional apprenticeship. It also opened up photography to many women. And I might be able to come back to this, not least Lucia Moholy-Nagy, who produced most of the famous images of the Bauhaus at Dessau, mostly unattributed. If I can draw some of this together, the new typography might be summed up in a few simple statements. Asymmetry in layout, sans serif type, photographic illustration, and the adoption of exclusively lowercase letter forms. Now, I'll come back to the question of lowercase letter forms, because not everyone believed that it was necessary. But it should be stated that this issue was driven as much by theoretical and political reasons as any practical design reasons. There was a widespread view among some of the new typographers, especially since many of them were communists or anarchists, that design expressed political ideals. And the uppercase or capital letters were akin to aristocratic lettering, and therefore should be done away with, and to use someone's quote, leveled out in the same way that the French Revolution had leveled out society. As many people pointed out at the time, notably Franz Rohe, I do not speak in capital letters, so why do we have to print with them? This was particularly problematic in the German language, where all nouns are capitalized. But there was a move to introduce solely lowercase lettering, and not just from the avant-garde. Many government agencies were advocating that this would simplify government and technical information, and it would be useful for education. So it was not a harebrained or radical idea on its own. As an example of the basic principles of the new typography in action, I've put up a poster for a dance festival in Essen in 1928 by Max Burchartz, one of the finest graphic designers of the interwar period, who deserves to be much better known. We can see how Burchartz came to these ideas independently, because he had attended the Bauhaus, but left in disgust after attending Theo van Doesburg's private classes in 1922. He also attended the rather chaotic Congress of Constructivists and Dadaists in Weimar that year. And you can see him standing on the left here with the child on his shoulders. Also in the group, interestingly, is ElLissitzky, Moholy-Nagy and Theo van Doesburg, as well as a number of other people who would turn to typography. Now, where Burchartz's journey took him from abstract painting to graphic design is fairly obvious when we look at his early paintings in a very style-like manner, as you can see in the composition 24A on the left. It wasn't such a leap to begin introducing text and photographic illustration to this abstract compositional framework, and to use the format as a means of advertising goods and services. By the mid-1920s, Burchartz had committed himself to a career in design, believing that it was above all the medium which would effect change in society more than the rarefied activities of painting and sculpture. Indeed, in the late 1920s, ElLissitzky would attack almost all of the avant-garde for their return to painting as an example of backsliding from the real mission to address social change. For many of these artist designers, it was graphics and architecture that would be the front line of a revolution in aesthetics and a revolution in society. In Burchartz's case, he took this very seriously, and he established one of the first graphic design studios in Germany, initially at Bochum and later in Essen, two industrial centres where he produced advertisements, brochures, catalogues, posters for many of the manufacturing firms in the Ruhr region of northwestern Germany, utilising all the formal elements that we've seen already. The company that he set up was Werbebau, Advertising Construction. And they produced a series of manifestos and guides to good design. And that's what the sheet on the bottom left is, the Werbeblatt. There is about a dozen of these, I gather, but I've only seen a few from the Tschichold collection, each of which put forward a polemic about the role of new technology in design and the ways in which, if used properly, they can exert an influence on society at large. So although Werbebau was set up as a commercial enterprise, they maintained their idealistic role as an agent of change and a campaigner for the larger ideals of radical politics. Another figure in this program of design and societal change is Walter Dexel, who had a similar trajectory to that of Burchartz. He had also been at the Bauhaus, but left in 1922, whereupon he began designing posters and advertisements for a variety of clients. One of his first posters is that on the top left, encouraging people to use gas. But I think you can see the extent to which it's based upon the kind of abstract compositions found in a number of paintings. In 1924, however, he moved to Jena, where he became involved in the Kunstverein, an artists' association with a gallery. And Dexel became the main curator and designed their publicity material, of which that small card on the bottom left is a very good example. Neue deutsche Baukunst, new German architecture. It gives a good indication of the ways in which he was experimenting with the elements of the typekeys to produce a very simple, austere, geometric design based entirely upon the disposition of blocks of type, printer's rules within a strict composition. Soon after that, Dexel moved to Magdeburg, where he taught graphic design at the Applied Arts College and developed a close relationship with the civic authorities, so that he was made responsible for advertising many major events. The two posters that you can see here for Die Sport and Photography der Gegenwart, Photography Now, were for exhibitions in 1929 put on by the City Council. And this is an indication of how several of the German regional and local authorities, as well as major industrial concerns, recognized the potential of this new movement in design to engage effectively with a large audience, while also imbuing the client and the event or product with a fashionable modern image. A third figure in this is Willy Baumeister, whom you may not have heard of, although he's very well known in Germany, primarily as an abstract painter. In the 1920s and 30s, however, he was working primarily as a graphic designer. He's probably best known for the graphics he designed for the Waisenhof Siedlung, a major architecture and design exhibition held in Stuttgart in 1927. This was something of a landmark in the history of modern architecture. But you can see the posters and publicity he produced for Die Wohnung, the home, which was a parallel exhibition covering interiors, models, and such like, for which Baumeister prepared a suite of designs, creating a form of event identity, from posters to catalogues, stamps, admission tickets, all with a single image using a bold sans serif title. Now, what I would like to emphasize at this point is the extent to which the movement is quite dispersed. Various innovative designers are working in parallel in various parts of Germany, and correspondingly, the curious fact that none of these figures was working in Berlin. Instead, they're in places like Magdeburg, Hanover, Bochum, Essen, Stuttgart, and in the next case, Frankfurt am Main. Frankfurt is often bypassed in histories of modern design, but if our views were not completely coloured by the Bauhaus, we might come to see Frankfurt as the real centre of the international avant-garde, shaped by constructivism alongside its socio-political agenda. It was in Frankfurt that Ernst May established a whole movement known as Das Neue Frankfurt, designing houses and affecting the broader social disposition of the city. The housing was of a very high standard, and it established various unitary and reproducible standardized formats, the most famous element of which was the so-called Frankfurt kitchen, designed by Margaret Schutte-Leshitsky. But alongside that, there was a program of cultural and leisure activities, concerts, exhibitions, sports, gardening projects, dance, which can be tracked as well as elaborated in the magazine Das Neue Frankfurt, so that the residents of what was in effect a corporation housing scheme could fully participate in the larger ideals of the overarching project. Das Neue Frankfurt, the magazine, contained articles, themes such as Soviet film, town planning, illuminated advertising, new modes of transport, photography, the chair. The design of the magazine and of much of the graphic advertising was undertaken by a very interesting brother and sister partnership of Hans and Grete Lestikov. Grete was the photographer and Hans the typographer, and they worked together designing the journal and the posters, employing all the characteristic features of the new typography. The last figure I want to draw attention to is Johannes Maltzen. To me, perhaps the finest of the designers I've focused on today. He was the one who established Magdeburg as a centre of teaching in graphic design. And he was also involved in publicity for the local authority, such as this poster on the left for an arts and crafts exhibition in 1925. In 1929, however, he was commissioned to design the publicity for the Deutsche exhibition Wohnung und Werkraum, Home and Workplace, in Breslau. I'm showing the main poster that Molzahn designed for the show, one of the finest pieces of photomontage of the period, bringing out the different hand skills involved in house building, while also suggesting the complex interaction of conceptual design through drawing and practical or physical engagement with the tools of construction. Like all the others I've mentioned, Molzahn was something of a campaigner and propagandist for the new typography. On his headed notepaper, which you can see at the bottom right, he added a manifesto of modern design, so that when you received your bill for services from the studio, you also got a lesson in the underlying principles of the new typography. So it was. Now, Molzahn was also a strong supporter of the Union of Book Printers. It was he who designed some of their publications. At that time, the Union was building a large new headquarters in Berlin, designed by Max Taut. To mark the opening, they produced a book in 1927, outlining the ideals of modern architecture and using the building as a key example. Molzahn designed the book Max Taut Bauten and Plane, Building and Plan, which has become a classic of modern book design, incorporating again the key elements of the new typography: sans serif lettering, asymmetry, and the free use of bold linear divisions, juxtaposing blocks of type with statements on the social role of architecture and using photography in bold geometric layouts. It should be remembered that the Union was not a small or narrowly focused organisation. In 1921, it had around 21,000 members, but by the end of the decade, under the direction of Joseph Seiss, there were over 80,000 members of the German Union of Book Printers, and they freely engaged in debates on modern design and culture, as well as the conditions and salaries of their members. This may explain their support for the new typography, but they were not the only official organisation behind it. The Deutsche Werkbund, the Association of Manufacturers, set up in 1907, was a supporter. Their magazine Die Form was launched in 1922, but it quickly folded in the face of the inflation of these years. As you can see, the cover design on the left was quite traditional, favouring a fine calligraphic style that was often found on deluxe editions. In 1925, however, when it was relaunched, they adopted a bold rectilinear asymmetrical design by the Bauhaus master Hust Schmidt. Finally, in 1928, they held a competition for a new cover design, which many of the leading typographers, including Tschichold, entered, and this was actually won by Walter Dexel. Each of these latter two designs, but especially the final one on the right, is a perfect essay in the new typography, as defined by Tschichold, and in this case applied to a mass circulation magazine. Now, mentioning Hust Schmidt might make you wonder where the Bauhaus is in this story. After all, I began the talk with the Bauhaus exhibition catalogue of 1923 and the essay by Moholy-Nagy, which gave its name to the movement. One of the problems faced by the Bauhaus in Weimar was the fact that it was not equipped to teach even the basics of practical typography, as is evident from the photograph of the Druckerei, or the print workshop in the catalogue. Those of you who've worked hand presses will recognize that this is really a rather inadequate set of equipment to teach designers ostensibly facing the demands of modern print production. They had in all 3 presses, an etching press at the back, a small lithographic press in the middle, and a platen press in the foreground, a German version of an American Franklin press that's generally used for proofing, not finished print runs. We also know that one of the presses was generally out of action at any one time in the Weimar period. Now, there is a story about why this was the case. Hust Schmidt suggested in a memoir that in 1914 the government had requisitioned the presses used in the previous Arts and Crafts College because they were owned by Henry van de Velde, who was of course a Belgian national. But it now appears that there was a different story. It was Count Harry Kessler, founder of the Cranach press in Weimar in 1914, and then refounded in 1925, very much along the lines of the English private press movement. In fact, Kessler commissioned many leading English designers and illustrators to contribute to the Cranach press books, not least Edward Johnson, Emery Walker, Eric Gill, and Edward Gordon Craig. But despite his reputation for liberal cosmopolitanism, Kessler was a virulent anti-communist, and he had a personal hatred of Gropius, whom he felt was presiding over a communist cell at the Bauhaus. He took back the presses, and although he was not using them at that stage, he withheld access from Bauhaus students and staff. The effect of this was that the Bauhaus was forced back on producing very traditional, pre-industrial types of hand craftsmanship, which was always a strong element in the Weimar Bauhaus. And that might help explain why the first manifesto was produced using a woodcut, the famous cathedral design by Lionel Feininger in the center at the bottom here. Perhaps the most primitive and simplest form of printing, and why for the first 6 years of its existence, the Bauhaus Print Workshop was engaged in producing limited edition artists' prints to be sold in themed portfolios. The Bauhaus did not have a substantial typecase, and no one with experience to set type, far less teach the craft of book design and typography. So, artists' prints is what was produced in these first years, and to some extent it made economic sense. Gropius recognized that the market for artists' prints was rising, and by a complete fluke, he discovered that the Bauhaus storage warehouse had a huge supply of high-quality handmade paper. Artists' prints made effective use of the limited resources available, but this might also explain why so many of the new typographers were hostile to the Bauhaus and its principles. There were masters and students in the Bauhaus with an interest in the new typography that was fast developing throughout Germany. Above all, Moholy-Nagy and his protege, Herbert Buyer. And of course, they could introduce certain features to the public image of the Bauhaus, not least in the publicity and the official documents of the college. The best example of this might be the headed notepaper of the designer, of the director, and this communicated an idea of modernity. But these were produced outside by commercial printers rather than in the college print workshop. Similarly, the Bauhaus book series, designed by Moholy-Nagy and edited by himself and Gropius, was produced by Albert Langen and printed by the printers associated with Langen's publishing house in Munich. So what we have is an image of the Bauhaus constructed partly by publicity and products, although these were never part of the teaching curriculum. This is not to decry Moholy-Nagy's approach, because he was clearly a very imaginative artist designer, as seen in his own book, which he designed, Painting, Photography, Film. But he had no interest in teaching graphic design because he couldn't teach it. He didn't know how to set type, nor did he know how to operate a press. Nevertheless, he produced an ethos within the college where there was great interest in the new typography. And when they moved to Dessau, they were able to equip a print studio in the basement of the new college, which was more substantial. But Moholy-Nagy was interested in a host of other areas: experimental media, film, photography, photograms and such like, photo montage, and above all, the interaction of light, movement and such like, rather than the principles of graphic design. One of the reasons for this is that his teaching was intended to be inspiring rather than practical. He was producing a range of works, but he did not want to limit himself to the practical aspects of training a generation of graphic designers. Now, Herbert Buyer tended to work within the Bauhaus, producing material on presses or with outside printers, but this was mostly for college events, as you can see in these famous items here. He was, to some extent, like the others we were looking at, Dexel, Burchartz, Molzahn, Schwitters, ElLissitzky, fascinated by sans serif typefaces, and of course he came up with his own alphabet, the famous universal alphabet in the top left, but it was never a typeface. Most of the work Buyer was designing was to meet the needs of college announcements, catalogues, brochures, posters for Bauhaus events, and among his finest achievements at Dessau was the Bauhaus magazine, begun in 1926. It was a very good expression of Bauhaus ideals, but it didn't bear any relation to what was known as Werbegrafik or Reklam, graphic design or advertising design, which he tried to teach but left within a few months in 1928. Now, while this was going on in the Bauhaus, whether they might teach graphic design was being taught all over Germany in other colleges. And a new group was emerging called the Ring Neuer Werbegestalter, the ring of new advertising designers, many of whom you will have heard of. Now, when it was launched, they did not have anything that might provide a proper basis. They had no premises, no funds, and no plans beyond the idea of an association. But you can see something of their ideals in the headed notepaper. This was designed by Kurt Schwitters for the ring on the left. On the right is Jan Tschichold's own headed notepaper. I thought it was quite interesting. In the very top right, he changed his designation to Jan Tschichold Ring Neue Werbegestalter, which just demonstrates his alignment with this group. The idea was that they would organize exhibitions. They planned a magazine, but none of that really developed into anything. And the fact that there was a need for some coordinating body is seen in the fact that almost immediately they had 32 members, and they opened it up to guest members, including people like Piet Zwart in the Netherlands, and Lajos Kasak from Hungary, and also Karel Tiger and Ladislav Sutnar, two leading Czech designers. The members were invited to send Schwitters examples of their work, which he organized into traveling exhibitions, which were so successful that at one stage they had 2 parallel exhibitions touring round Northern Europe. They also wanted to collaborate, to promote things. And when they wrote to the Bauhaus, inviting them to collaborate on exhibitions, they received a rather discouraging reply. This was the Bauhaus response to the invitation to the college to participate in Ring's activities. As you can see, it was not really very positive. Basically, it was a rather high-handed dismissal of the proposed collaboration. We might like to be involved, but only on our terms. And if the Ring is keen to collaborate, we will perhaps permit it, but we will have to be put in charge. Schwitters, who was the secretary, or at least his wife was, rather wickedly sent this response round all the members of the Ring, and then they wrote back to him, unfortunately anonymously. And these are some of the comments on what the current typographers felt was the Bauhaus. Let's wait a bit, and then we'll be stronger and can bear the dirt that's thrown up after the Bauhaus. In every commitment with the Bauhaus, only the Bauhaus has benefited. It's not a very flattering view of the Bauhaus when one considers the range of avant-garde artists, designers, and architects across Germany. Now, it was not until 1927 that the Bauhaus introduced a course on what we would call graphic design, and indeed that folded after a few months, although it was taken up by Hust Schmidt. But Herbert Buyer left in 1928, and we can see here his departure. That was his ticket for his farewell party at the top, and down below is his advertising sheet with, as you can see in the center, Dessau, D with Dessau scored out and B with Buyer. He was moving to Berlin. Now this left Hust Schmidt in charge of the print workshop, who was a rather good graphic designer, but he had no experience of commercial printing or the commercial applications of typography at that stage. It also led to a division in the coverage of recent activity in the various trade exhibitions at the end of the 1920s, so that we can see how these exhibitions became a forum for the new typography. This was the Soviet exhibition at Presa, held in Cologne in 1928, one of the largest and grandest. But similarly, at Film and Photo the following year in Stuttgart, it was Baumeister who designed the catalogue, and many of the Ring members were involved in the selection committee and indeed had whole sections devoted to them. In both of these exhibitions, the Bauhaus played only a marginal role, while the members of the Ring were at the centre of the organisation. Then in 1930, an exhibition and publication called Gefesselter Captured Glance, was prepared by Heinz and Bodo Rasch with the support of the Swiss Werkbund. This was a survey of the leading modernist graphic designers in Central Europe. 26 in all were selected, and of that group, only one participant was from the Bauhaus, and that was Moholy-Nagy, who had, of course, left the Bauhaus 2 years earlier. The other 25 were members of the Ring, or correspondents and their guests from outside Germany. Indeed, Herbert Buyer always remained somewhat aloof from these group activities, and although the Ring continued its various exhibitions, Buyer embarked on an independent career, working for various magazines and private clients. The work he produced after leaving the Bauhaus rarely conformed to the classic tenets of the new typography, either formally or in terms of the radical political and social agenda that the leading figures advocated. Instead, Buyer employed a much richer colour palette in his work and showed greater interest in the uncanny effects of surrealism. It's perhaps no accident, however, that in 1933, virtually every designer I have mentioned in this talk either lost their job when the Nazis came to power or went into exile. Tschichold was arrested and imprisoned before being released and fleeing to Switzerland. Herbert Buyer, however, was able to continue working for the official agencies of the Nazi Party, notably on the series of exhibitions held in Berlin, Das Wunder des Lebens, The Wonder of Life, and Deutsche Volk, which you can see at the bottom here, right up until 1938, when he emigrated to the USA. By that time, the new typography as a movement had been all but obliterated in Germany by the institutional and legal changes. The rise of close censorship of the print and other communication media, and the rigid centralized structure of preferment and approval that came through the departments of the Nazi Party. The designers themselves were dispersed throughout Germany and to other countries. Tschichold to Switzerland, the Leshitsky to Soviet Russia, John Hartfield to Czechoslovakia, others to Hungary, to the Netherlands and to France, from where they had to flee again to Britain and then eventually often to the USA. But many remained in Germany and went underground or took other jobs that did not attract attention to their modernist political ideals, only to reappear in 1945, when several of them were re-employed in the reconstruction of Germany after the war and restore the principles of the new typography for a new generation, some of which would reappear under the name of Swiss design in the 1950s. And I think that is the end and the beginning of a different story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was such a comprehensive and absolutely fascinating insight into Jan Tschichold and everyone involved in the new typography. Thank you so much. I know lots of people have been messaging about how much they're loving this and things. So thank you on behalf of everyone at St. Bride for such a brilliant talk. And if we were actually at St. Bride, the hall would be full of rapturous applause right now. So I'm sorry that it's silence and just me talking and conveying that wonderful rapturous applause. I know everyone, I've been getting a few private messages saying how everyone is loving it so much. We do have time for questions, and I know there's a few in the chat coming through. So we'll carry on as long as they go on, unless it goes on for like 3 hours of questions. But yeah, so I will just go through and read out some of the comments. Richard Armitage has just said, hi everyone, this is a blast from the past for me when I was studying in the 60s, which is great. And someone has also said that they're loving Walter Dexel's work. There's just so many amazing visuals here. I know I'm going to be really excited to look at the recording again and look at everything in more detail, which is fantastic. So the first question is from Suzanne Perkins. Hi Suzanne. How would he have created the type perspective? Was it photography? Do you know the details?
I presume, Suzanne, you mean in the posters that he produced for the Liebespalast cinema. He didn't use type in these. Again, most of the lettering was hand-drawn. And one gathers from his reports that he basically did everything of the night, overnight, hand-drawing the lettering and basically producing camera-ready copy with pasting things down. But the lines were drawn either, probably not straight onto the stone, but prepared in camera-ready copy and then transferred to an offset lithographic press. So there was no type, and the lines themselves were hand-drawn as well.
Yeah.
These posters do look very rigid and precise. So it's a measure actually of Jan Tschichold's training as a calligrapher, that he could so effectively reproduce the effects of type in hand drawing, and all done at breakneck speed.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible what you could achieve. It's just thinking now, chatting to students about what we can do in InDesign and before it existed, how people did things is quite amazing. We've had a comment from Simon Loxley just saying that the Weimar Republic period is just insanely creative, particularly in light of the political economic crises going on in Germany from 1918 to 23, and of course after. So yeah, that was just a comment from Simon. So Andrew Hobbs has asked, where did these ideas, styles spread to beyond Germany?
Well, this as a movement is, with the exception of the Netherlands, it's primarily a Central European phenomenon. In other words, from Germany eastward, there were a number of, many of the members of the Ring, but even before the Ring was established in 1927-28, there were a number of people in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, to a lesser extent Yugoslavia, but especially in obviously the Soviet Union, at least up until the late 20s, when a chill emerged, largely through the shift to what would ultimately be socialist realism, which only became state policy, I think it was in 1932, but really after 1928 it was much restricted. And ElLissitzky, for example, and Rodchenko moved into other areas. But it was very prominent in Poland, Hungary, and especially Czechoslovakia, where there was a lot of government support. Remember, Czechoslovakia was only established as a country in 1918-19, and the government was committed to the idea of the new Czechoslovakia was going to start with a clean sheet, tabula rasa. So they were strongly committed to modernism in all aspects of design. And so the new typography had a lot of, had a sort of high prominence, sorry, about that. Had a very high prominence in the government publicity as much as in general advertising. So it really is across Central Europe. As I mentioned, the other great centre is, of course, the Netherlands. The Dutch, then as now, were just amongst the most innovative designers and also the most exacting in their use of type.
Sure, thank you. From Jeff, did Tschichold have any particular views or prejudices about the typographic machinery of the time, the linotype, monotype casting machines, etc.?
Now that is an interesting point, and I've not read much of it. One of the problems with Tschichold, because he must be well known to everyone in this, anyone who's picked up a Penguin book will, of course, know him from that period. But famously, Tschichold's life or career, at least, famously is divided in the late 1930s, when he rejected a lot of his earlier very dogmatic principles. But and one of the effects of this is that most of his writings about his work are from after he really moved away from the new typography, or at least from its very rigid political and design ideals. So a lot of the time his comments looking backwards are hard to interpret, or not hard to interpret, it's difficult to interpret what he felt at the time. He's very often talking in retrospect. But I've not read anything from the 1920s and 30s about his view of the new technology, particularly monotype or linotype. And you would expect that. I should perhaps look back at the, there is of course a very good edition of the new typography, which was translated into English and published a long time ago. with an excellent introduction by Robin Kinross. I should have to go back and have a look at that, but I haven't come across anything that where Tschichold says much about that kind of technology. One thing I would mention though is that Tschichold was committed to new technology. One of the reasons I wanted to emphasize the fact that while ElLissitzky and Schwitters and Moholy-Nagy are very interesting as designers, they were not trained in the use of presses or any other aspect of printing. Tschichold is the opposite. He had a conventional training as a printer and typographer and came to the avant-garde later. So that explains something of his commitment to the new principles of design and the new technologies that were coming available.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Catherine. Why do you think that orange was used as the second colour in so many of the works of the time?
Well, most of them, some of them may have been slightly distorted, but most of them use a very intense red.
Okay.
For, well, red being used since the time of Gutenberg, but also, as I tried to indicate earlier, it's a primary colour which they associated with many of the new ideals from the style and suprematism. And also, not to put too fine a point on it, many of the new typographers were at least fellow travellers, if not absolutely Communist Party members, and believed that the combination of red and black had a symbolic role in the well, the political dimension of the new movement. But there is an element that quite a number of them began to use an orange. And I think this may simply be, I don't know if there's anything about the inks available in German. But remember, German ink and presswork was of the highest standard, even after the depredations of the war and the destruction of German industry by the Allies, mostly the French. They pillaged a lot of German industrial installations. And after 1922, the Germans made a great bid to re-equip their traditional industries, above all printing. So there was a lot of high quality printing and inks produced. But I couldn't say much more than the preference for orange, which did emerge, particularly in the late 1920s, as perhaps being an aesthetic choice.
Absolutely. A question from Stephen. If you don't touch upon it in the rest of this presentation, I was wondering if you could talk about Tschichold's eventual disowning of modernist ideas in the new typography.
It's a very important feature, as I mentioned earlier, partly to do with Tschichold's, I think in a way it was recanting on some of the grander principles, and it may be partly because of his so total was his commitment to both the political and the design principles at the heart of the new typography, hence him changing his name to Ivan Tschichold. Now, in some respects, the new typography was most suited to advertising. And Tschichold had an aversion to advertising on a moral as well as various other technical principles, in that he was primarily and wanted to remain primarily a book designer. And during the 1930s, and particularly the shock and danger of his imprisonment in 1933, when he settled in Switzerland, and he had to find some fairly conventional work to be allowed to stay in Switzerland, whether it was through pressure or choice, but I would tend to think it was through moderation of his earlier ideals, he became more sympathetic to the classic ideals of book printing and looked back above all to Venetian Renaissance printing as a model, for some of his work. So that by the end of the war, he was totally committed to the use of different source material, different typefaces for different jobs. Now, this has famously caused a dispute between Tschichold and Max Bill. Max Bill, who still wanted to uphold the principles of the new typography and was indeed instrumental in re-establishing the College of Design at Ulm, where he wanted to reassert the Bauhaus principles of abstraction, constructivism, and a social dimension to design. Max Bill accused Tschichold of being a traitor to the cause, and Tschichold then turned on Max Bill and said that he was the equivalent of a Nazi on the left. It became very bad-tempered, and they each published open letters criticizing the other. I can't make a definitive statement on it, but I think so extreme was Tschichold's position in the mid-1920s. Perhaps he could only but moderate that position, and the political circumstances that he found himself in during the 1930s as an alien in Switzerland and forced to produce work that was much more conventional, he became more sympathetic to the classic ideals of high-quality historic typography. He never totally abandoned the new typography, but believed that it was perhaps only suitable for certain types of work. It's in a way, it's a real problem at the heart of modernism in design. And it's only talked about within the field of graphics and typography, but it's one of these classic debates that should be as well known as some of the great debates in architecture.
That's great, thank you. We have a question from Caroline. As a type novice, I would like to know about the continuing influence of Jan Tschichold today. That's something you know about much, also.
Well, well, as you know, Tschichold died a long time ago. Can't remember off the top of my head, but he is still held in very high esteem in most centres, in Europe at least. I mean, I was surprised to find that when I organised my exhibition in New York, he was not so well known. I took it for granted, having been brought up in Britain and used Penguin books all my life, that people knew about Jan Tschichold. But it's through Penguin as a model of mass publishing, also with a kind of social agenda, that Tschichold's legacy carries on. Now, whether that continues to inspire practicing designers or the image of Penguin as a high quality, simple, accessible and cheap form of design and education, I think that is probably the legacy. I don't really come across many designers saying that they're either looking to Tschichold's later classical work rather than his modernist work. The modernist work still appeals, nor do I find many designers declaring a particular love for any of his three typefaces. Johannes still quite often used, but that seems to have fallen away as well. So I think it's the ideal of the social role of the graphic designer. And I think Tschichold throughout his life held to that and offered a model that I would hope was still a vital part of both training and practice in design.
Great.
It's a wishy-washy answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. So from Judith Aronson, do you have an opinion about the Max question? Bill article against Tschichold's switch back to more traditional typography.
Well, as I mentioned briefly earlier, I've tended not to take sides on this, and I don't think Bill and Tschichold were in fact polar opposites during that period. I think the tone of the argument made it very bitter and antagonistic. But if anything, I have to say I'm possibly with Tschichold, I still regard myself as an unreconstructed modernist. And therefore, I'm much more interested in his work of the 20s and 30s. But well, this is an entirely personal view. I think Max Bill is a pain in the neck sometimes. And I think even if I agreed with him, I'd probably want to take an opposing position at times. But I think he was being very hard on Tschichold at that time. And Tschichold should probably have moderated his response, but instead chose to confront Bill on the same level. But it's a meaty read, their dispute, if you want to read two giants of 20th century design knocking lumps out of one another.
Absolutely. We have a slightly different question, which has been posed as a cheeky, irrelevant question from Elizabeth. Is that a blown up full stop behind you on the picture of the wall?
I only realised when I sat down here that this looked like an emanation out of the top of my head. It's an ink drawing by the Scottish artist William Johnson, who was head of Central St Martin's, which had a famous typography and printing department. But one of his drawings, but it does look like there's smoke coming out the top of my head.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I think a final question from Andy Edwards. Do you think the migration of Central European modernism to Switzerland and the US in the late 30s depoliticized it and put it back to work for, depoliticized it and put it to work for capitalism?
Yes, I do. I mean, as a simple, bold statement. Now, it's obviously more complicated. It is refined. The principles of the new typography are refined and elaborated. But there was a central problem which Tschichold appreciated, but which Suttner and some of the others did not, that the new typography is best suited to advertisements, where labels, logos, catchphrases, and the juxtaposition of short, dramatic text and imagery. Tschichold, as I indicated earlier, had a slight problem, a real problem with advertising, which he felt was an agent of capitalism. But Lajos Kasak, for example, felt that modern advertising would be the great moderating influence to even out society. That was a bit naive. And in fact, the way that the new typography entered into the American mainstream and throughout Europe in the post-war period, through Switzerland and other centres, it was primarily in the field of advertising. And of course, it lost its political edge, where it was intended to become a form that paralleled revolutionary content, and it simply it didn't work in that sense. And although my fascination with it is boundless, I'm prepared to admit that there was a central problem there, and it would ultimately become a tool of capitalism.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that's it from our questions.